Hi everyone, I'm Andrew Jacob, going with the lesson from the book First Flight, chapter number 2, Nelson Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom. Before I go with the book, I'm going to read out or speak out a few lines which you may have heard about it. At the stroke of midnight, when the world sleeps, India will awake to light and freedom. This was the moment when India became free, and Pandit Nehru declares at the stroke of midnight India to be a free country on 15th August 1947. Wow, what a moment. How those lines from the Tryst with Destiny, that is the book name, where Pandit Nehru gives the call to the world that India has become free. Likewise, South Africa, which was suffering from this, I'm going to speak out a word, the spelling is different and you speak it out like, the spelling is A-P-A-R-T-H-E-I-D. But how it is pronounced, how we speak out or how we spell out is apartheid. South Africa, a country in African continent, was under the Europes, under the whites. So that's what I said. I've written the meaning it as separate people according to race. Race means it can be a religion, it can be region, but here when I'm talking about a race, it is about the color of the skin. So here there was a person, like we had Mahatma Gandhi, we call him as the father of our country. But here in South Africa, we have a person and his name is Nelson Mandela, and he is considered to be the father of the nation. So here Nelson Mandela was or became the president of South Africa. Now, South Africa is a country in the continent of Africa. It's a country. There are many countries over there. But South Africa is a country in the continent of, South Africa is a country in the continent of Africa. So here we are talking about long walk to freedom. This very person, Nelson Mandela, is describing. Now before we go with what we are going with is, Nelson Mandela is talking about long walk to freedom. Now I'll bring out the difference between biography and autobiography. If I write about a particular person, it is biography. If I'm going to write about, say if I'm going to write about our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, that becomes biography. But if Mr. Narendra Modi is going to write about himself, about him as the Prime Minister, it becomes autobiography. So when you're writing about yourself, it becomes autobiography, and if you're writing about something else, you write it as, you say it as biography. If I'm going to write about someone else, it is biography. And if I'm writing it, if I'm going to talk about myself in a book, I'm going to talk about my experience, then it becomes autobiography. Here Nelson Mandela talks about the long walk to freedom. From whom? From the clutches of apartheid. When I said apartheid, I repeat the spelling, A-P-A-R-T-H-E-I-D. Apartheid means the racism. They were all being in the racism, or they were being tormented. The blacks, I'm not supposed to use the word blacks, but here in the book itself, you find that there are two denominations. Today, calling someone by black and someone by white, it itself is a racism. We are not supposed to do it. But then what the lesson says is that the blacks were dominated by the whites. Likewise, in India also, we had the same this. The white man's burden, that's what we learn in history. What is white man's burden? The people of white thought that the brown and the blacks were of a lower category. They were supposed to be treated in a different way. They are supposed to be civilized, and it was the burden of the Britishers or the Europeans who came over here, the French, the Portuguese, the English who came here. Likewise, South Africa was also dominated by the European continent. And you find that, why? Because when the Britishers came to India, it was for many things like the spices, the cotton, the raw material like the cotton, to sell the finished goods in the market of India, and for the indigo, the blue color, the indigo, which we use for white clothes. Now it is not in use, but in those days when people were wearing white, the muslin, they were supposed to be dipped in blue or the indigo so that the white becomes more brighter. So here you find that just like the Britishers came to India to get these raw material, these finished product to be sold in the Indian market, we became their colonies. Right? Likewise, South Africa was dominated. Why? Because South Africa was rich in the wealth called the gems, the diamonds, and other valuable stones. It was found in plenty. So South Africa, the country of South Africa, came under the European tyranny. And you find that they were all under the colonies of the Europeans. And Nelson Mandela turned out to be the leader, just like we had Mahatma Gandhi and various other leaders who fought for the freedom of our country. Likewise, they also had this freedom movement. Like we had the INC, the Indian National Congress. You find that the Africans also had the party called African National Congress, and Mr. Nelson Mandela was the president of the African National Congress. Now, if I talk about his life, he was born in 1918. He was born in 1918. This is the year when Nelson Mandela was born, and he passed away in the year 2013. So what was the span of life? He was there. He came to this world on 18 July 1918, and he passed away on 5th December 2013. He is now talking in this lesson. What is he actually talking about? He is talking about the freedom and how the different countries. Now, when did we get the freedom? If you look at our freedom, it was way back, many years back in the year 1947. But when did they get the freedom? It was in 1994. Few years back. Just few years back, the country, South Africa, got freedom. And here we are talking about that celebration. When did we get the freedom? On 15th August 1947 at the stroke of midnight. And I gave you the version of Pandit Nehru's speech, India awoke into freedom at the stroke of midnight. And likewise, it was not at the stroke of midnight, but for the South Africans, it was on the bright day, and it was in the year 1994. So, for the celebration, various people from various, that means important presidents, prime ministers of various countries had all gathered for their first declaration that South Africa is going to be a free nation. So you find that there were many on 10th May 1994, South Africa was supposed to declare itself free from the building called Pretoria. Pretoria. From the building called Pretoria, he was to make the announcement that South Africa was to be a free nation, a country by itself, liberated from all apartheid, from all racism. And that was the speech he was to give. So, and he was accompanied by his daughter, and his daughter was Zenani. Zenani. Zenani, his daughter, was with him for the presidential address. And he was happy, he was way too happy to see that the country which he has fought. Can you imagine the number of years he was there in the prison? He was there in the prison for not 1 year, not 2 years, but as long as 27 years he was in prison. He was in his good young days, I can tell, in his good young days, he had spent all his life in the prisons of South Africa because he was not allowed to express himself. He was caught in the clutches of the Britishers. So you find from the Pretoria, you find that he was supposed to give the speech about or to declare South Africa to be free. I would like to just go with few lines of his speech, though you may not be having your books. If you want to go with the books, you can go with the PDF files. And if you don't have a NCERT book, you can go with a PDF file. I'll just read few lines because I feel that these lines, without being read, it won't touch the heart or it won't touch the meaning what Nelson Mandela want to convey. Today, all of us do, by our presence here, confirm glory and hope to the newborn, liberated South Africa. This word, just see, newborn, a baby, that's what he calls. A baby from where? From what? From the apartheid, away from the racism. A new baby is born, and that's why he's very happy to declare. And he says, we have at last achieved emancipation, free from all terror, all fear, all freedom, right? All freedom, freedom to express, freedom of press, freedom of everything he was talking about. Now he himself talks about what is freedom. As a young boy, what is a freedom? Not to study, watch television, play as you like. You don't want to be timed out. You don't want your mother to tell you, beta, it's time, your play has to come down, it's stopped. You have to sit before your books. And that is what the freedom of a young boy is. Young boy means I'm talking about school boy. When you teenage up, when you become a teen, what is the freedom? Go for parties, have your own ways, have celebration, and that is freedom, right? Even Nelson Mandela talks about all this freedom, but here we are not talking about that type of freedom. We are talking about freedom to be anywhere in your country without fear of police, without the fear of any sort of any type of fear, and that freedom is what we are talking. So he declares that. What does he say? He declares what? His country to be free. And here he says, we have at last achieved our political emancipation, that is freedom from all restriction. Now we are having lockdown. We are going through a phase of lockdown. We are supposed, even those areas where we are supposed to move out at 7 a.m. By 6 p.m. the shops are shut down, the groceries and all shops are shut down, and we are supposed to reach back home by 7 p.m. There is a restriction. That also we can call as emancipation, because we are being restricted because of a certain reason. But that on those days, on those years, they were restricted. Why? Because of this word apartheid. I love this word apartheid. Why? Because it's a word which means to be succumbed to a separate people according to races. To put it in bracket, people of different races, and that is what is apartheid. So here we say that, now I read the last lines of his speech, that last paragraph. Never, never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. He does not talk about the word white, he does not talk about the word black, but he talks oppression of one by another. Right? Because he's not talking to his own people only. There are so many delegates from various countries, the prime ministers, the presidents, and all those big political national heroes of various countries are there to hear. So he cannot use, he says, oppression by one on another. That means I cannot oppress anyone. That's what he says. He's talking about how South Africa was oppressed by some other group of ethnic group, and that's why this word apartheid becomes very critical in the moment. And this word seems to be, I remember in 1994, this word apartheid, when Nelson Mandela took the oath as a president, he used this word apartheid, and it was ringing in the ears of millions of people around the world, how South Africa, though we talk about the 20th century, we were nearing 20th century. In fact, we crossed the 20th century to 21st century, and still there were countries which were under the racism. Now, here he talks about a little, in the next paragraph, he talks about the celebrations. He talks about how the jet was blowing out smoke, and the color of the smokes, he talks about the color, because the South African flag's color was red. It included the color of red, it included the color of black, it includes the color of green, it includes the color of golden color, right, and blue. If you look at the flag of Africa, South Africa, you find all these colors, and the jet was screaming, throwing out for the celebration. As they were sitting for the celebration, the smokes of red, black, green, gold, and blue was blown in or blown out as a respect or as a part of celebration. But Nelson Mandela thoughts moved for a different direction. He was thinking about few years before, maybe in 1980s, before South Africa became free, how these military today who was honoring Nelson Mandela could have treated him as a prisoner. Because I told his span of years in prison was 27 years. I don't think there were prisoners, freedom fighters in our country who would have spent so many years in the prison. So it was 27 years in the prison. And here he talks about how today the military which was honoring him could have had him in prison, and how he would have been humiliated. So a thought goes of how he was treated in those ST years and how today it is a different level. Why? Because after the long walk to freedom, you find that the military is saluting, it's throwing the color of the national flag, and he says that the national anthem of Africa was sung. Now, national anthem of Africa was sung. So I would like to write something which it must be little obvious, because the national anthem of our country, if we look at the national anthem of our country, it is only one, isn't it? But that day, there were two national anthems which was sung. Nosi Sikil I Africa. Again, I repeat, it is Sikil Noksi Sikil I Africa, and this was sung by the whites, and Die-Stem was sung by the blacks. I told you, apartheid means it's about racism. And what racism are we talking about? The racism not of religion, not of region, but of the color of the skin. So Noksi Sikili E Africa was sung by the whites, and Die-Stem was sung by the blacks. And this was how the national anthem was sung. So the day symbolized for me by the playing of our two national anthems, and the visions of whites singing Snoski Sikli and the blacks singing Die-Stem, the old anthem of the Republic. So these two anthems were sung. So he is now talking about the celebration which was going on. I told you, when did they celebrate? When did South Africa become free? On 10th May 1994, before a huge delegates from different corners of the world. They are all assembled, and just like Pandit Nehru had given the speech in the Tryst with Destiny, you find that here Nelson Mandela gives a speech. He declares South Africa to be free on 10th May 1994, and you find that he was accompanied by his daughter Zeneni. Now you find that they were there on the stage on the podium declaring South Africa free. So he is talking here in few lines. He talks about the celebration. Then he talks about the anthem which was sung. Now here he talks about how Africa became in the clutches of the Anglos. Now what is Anglos? The Anglos are the Europeans, or it's a reference to the English. In India, we have a community called the Anglo-Indians. What is the Anglo-Indians? You find that those who are born out of the relation between the English and the Indians, they were known as Anglo-Indians. So likewise, from the Anglo-Boer War, Anglo-Boer, B-O-E-R, Boer War, Africa came under the clutches or under the racism. And he says that he remembers as a young boy how Africa, how the white-skinned people took the birthright of the blacks. And from which war? It's Anglo-Boer War. It's not necessary to remember, but then if you have to understand the movement of South Africa's independence, you have to understand that through the Anglo-Boer War, how the freedom of the blacks were taken into the clutches of the whites, by the whites. Now, in the last decade of the 20th century and my own eight decades. What is a decade? Decade means 10 years. Decade means 10 years. Can you imagine when Africa became, or when he became the president of Africa, he was almost 80 years. Can you imagine? He had to be 80 years, almost 8 decades had passed when he wanted to declare Africa from the clutches of the blacks and from the clutches of the whites and the blacks becoming free. And here you find that, here it says that it was the time for them to rejoice. And rejoice that day had come about through the unimaginable. So he just, as he was sitting, as he was looking at the celebration, he was just remembering the sacrifices of thousands of people, thousands of Africans who had laid their life, who had given their life, who had been suffering for the want of the freedom. And you find that these Africans who had suffered, they were not there alive to see what? To be a part of the celebration. Again, I repeat, they were not allowed to be the part of the celebration. And when were they celebrating the freedom? On 10th May 1994. And that was a year when Africa was, or South Africa, I cannot say Africa, but South Africa country became free from the clutches of the white. I felt that the day, as I have on so many others, and I was simply the sum of all those African patriots. You find that here, Nelson Mandela, maybe on a podium, maybe on a stage, declaring Africa or South Africa to be free from the clutches. Way back from decades, they were under the clutches of the whites through the racism, which was termed as apartheid. And here this word apartheid has to be understood. Why? Because being under the clutches of a different race is known as apartheid. And here you find that the national anthem was sung so noski, sickly, A Africa was a song, or the national anthem sung by the whites. The stem was the song sung by the blacks. And this is how the celebration went. So a few memories went through of how many decades they had suffered. And he was having a small memory of those great African patriots who had laid up their life. I wind up now about the dreams of Nelson Mandela, but then I'll come up with the next part of this topic, who were the other great leaders who were with him, and how he goes on to describe again about the celebration, and again about the suffering, and how as a child, how he took freedom to be, and as a young man, as a teenager, what was freedom for him, and when he grew up, what was freedom for him. And these are the different levels which he's talking about, and I will do it for the next class. See you then. Stay home, stay safe.